So let's take a look at Lifecycle Manager and how you can leverage its stateful orchestration capabilities to help track and manage all the different complex network and infrastructure services that you may offer. When you think about one of these infrastructure services, you might immediately think about all the different network resources that may comprise that service. But when we're talking about Lifecycle Manager, we're enabling you to not only orchestrate an end-to-end process to provision and manage these services, but also track the data that's relevant to those services. And this data can be network related within a single domain or multiple domains, but we can also allow you to track other information that might be applicable or useful to that you might want to track for a service. So for instance, if you're offering a service to a customer, you might track the customer name, the customer ID, maybe some order information, or even a ServiceNow change request or incidents request ticket. All of this is available to be tracked within the platform through integrations, through workflows, and with Lifecycle Manager, we allow you to, in a flexible way, define exactly what you want to track. And I'll show you that now. So in this case, we're taking a look at an application hosting service. So with an application hosting service, we are going to be tracking the details from 3 different infrastructure domains. And let me collapse this so we can talk about it a little more clearly. And this application has components. So when we host an application service and instantiate that for one of our customers, they have a set of components that are going to be in the AWS cloud, a set of components in the data center that are used, some ports, and then some security parameters that have to be set up in our firewall system. So for a single application service that we instantiate, we want to also not only just instantiate the infrastructure to host the application, tie it all together, but we also want to track the information relevant to that particular instance. So the first thing we do is we create what's called a resource model, and that's what we're looking at now. Because of the flexibility in allowing you to track pretty much anything you want, we want to allow you to do that through a JSON schema that you define here. And so if you're not familiar, a JSON schema is a standard format for representing organized and hierarchical data. And in this case, we've created a JSON schema that defines the properties that we want to track for a particular application hosting service instance. So in this case, you'll see we've created a section here, an object called Cloud Infrastructure Parameters. And in that, these are going to hold the variables that hold the data for things like VPCs, a subnet ID, the Internet Gateway ID. For a particular instance, in the data center, we want to track things. So when an instance is created, we want to identify and track things like the region it's in, the interface name, and the IP address that's been associated with it. And then finally, for security parameters, obviously there's going to be some firewalls that need to be set up. And so that's what's being held here is the firewall policy details. So with all that, we've defined our model of resources. And again, these are 3 different infrastructure types of resources that we're tracking. We could also do things like, date of instantiation, maybe a status line that could be determined and defined here. And like I said earlier, if you've got ServiceNow tickets or Jira tickets that you want to associate with this, you could certainly do that. You have the flexibility when you create the resource model. So once the resource model is created, now we need to define a series of actions. So an action is categorized into 3 major categories here. We have create actions, update actions, and delete actions. So for create actions, these are when you provision the service initially. And provisioning the service initially is usually done one time, as well as delete. You can typically decommission it one time. However, you can have as many of these actions as you want because they're associated with workflows, and we'll take a look at that now. Probably the most likely category that you're going to have multiple actions related to workflows is under update, because that allows you to now take a service and perhaps it has multiple stages that it's in. It could be turned up but not activated. It could be activated but not ready for customer acceptance, could be decommissioned. Those are some of the statuses. So your updates can have a series of workflows associated in the update category that can move forward not only the service and in the infrastructure, but also the status. So in this case, let's take a look at the provisioning under the create. So this is going to provision our new service. So when we want to create a new instance, this is the workflow we can choose. It's under the create actions. And you'll notice here we have a workflow that's been associated with it. And if I click this into a new tab and we can take a look at it, this is a orchestrated workflow that is going to provision all three of those different infrastructure types. The first, if we follow the workflow here, the first child job is built to create the cloud infrastructure in AWS. The next big child job here is to create the underlying data center infrastructure and ports. And then finally, this is going to update the firewall with the security rules that we want to apply for this service. Going back to Lifecycle Manager, so when this action is run, it's going to run this workflow. This workflow can be a pre-existing workflow that you've already created in the platform. We're just re-leveraging it so that we can use it to track instance state within Lifecycle Manager. Now, at the end of this is we have something called a transformation after the workflow is created, or after the workflow runs, because remember, when we're provisioning all of those three different infrastructures in that workflow, we have all of the data that's output of that available. So the data that is output from those that sequence of provisioning tasks, we want to capture some of that data because that's the information we want to track. And so there's a mapping exercise that happens with the transformation. Transformations is how we can not just map but transform data so that we can take the output from perhaps one task, modify it so that it can use elsewhere in a workflow, but in this case, so that we can track it according to the resource model that we created. So if we take a look at that, you'll see on the left side we have a series of, this is also a JSON but schema, but this is the output from the workflow that was run as part of the provisioning task. On the right-hand side, I want you to pay special attention here. This is the resource model that was created as part of that first step that we showed. Here's your cloud infrastructure parameters. Here's your data center port parameters. Here's your security rule parameters. So this is going to map the data from the workflow during that provisioning process into these variables so that they can be stored and saved so that when an instance is created, it's tracked at the orchestration layer. So let's go back for a moment to here, and we'll take a look at the delete decommission workflow action. So in this action, we also have another workflow at play here with another post transformation that does precisely the same things we saw before. But let's take a look at this pre-transformation, because this is also a really nice feature of Lifecycle Manager. So when we track something that's been created and all that data, it might be useful for both updates and decommissions or deleting that instance to be able to reference it again, and that's precisely what happens here. So when an instance is created, the data that's tracked from the original creation, provisioning process and workflow, it's stored, but we also have access to it. So what this transformation does, it's a mapping exercise again, but it's saying, give me the instance data for this particular instance, and specifically VPC IDs for the infrastructure and things like that. Data center information, security parameters, and now let's map that out so it can be utilized by a workflow. And so we expose this as a workflow through this transformation. So now the workflow has the data it needs to check the infrastructure, decommission the infrastructure, and reclaim those resources so that they can be used somewhere else. So I'll go back to Lifecycle Manager. So those are your actions. So we went model, we created a model, we created a series of actions, or took a look at a series of actions that need to be created. In this case, create and delete. Update, again, we could apply some actions there as workflows. Those would be very, very helpful and useful. So for instance, if you have a service to a customer and maybe some bandwidth parameters, and over the life cycle of that particular service, a customer may want to increase or decrease their bandwidth, an update workflow could be done here. In this case, perhaps maybe the firewall rules might change or need to be extended. We could create an update action by assigning a workflow to it to update the firewall rules as necessary, and then track those, make sure those are tracked and updated in the instance information. And speaking of instance, we'll go here to the instances. This is where you get a complete readout of all of the service instances that have been created. In this case, we have a series of different customers. If I take a look at one of the customers here, you'll see one of the first things under the action tab specific to this customer is the ability now to run from here any kind of update workflow actions, or in this case, decommission it. So I can quickly move the state of that particular instance along based off of the different workflows that I have available as actions. We continue to track the properties of that, and again, notice that these are the resource model properties that we've assigned here. And I'll show you how to create a new instance. So here we'll click Create New Instance. We'll give it a name. I'll call it Customer C. Our action, so again, we have one create action. This is where this is pulling from here, but if we had multiple for different reasons, you could have them applied here. I'm going to give this a new VPC name, so it's unique. This is filling out sample information from our that's embedded in our JSON schema that was defined in the resource model initially. So you can pull information there, and we can also use this as a form. And under security rules, I'll give it a new identifier called Customer C. In this case, when you have, we're auto-generating a form, so the different fields, whether they're clickable fields or expandable fields, are all available to us. And so we can use these as a form. Your create workflow can also directly access different sources that you need on your network through integrations. So in fact, this workflow, when I run it, will pull information and IP addresses from info blocks and an IP address from netbox and some inventory information from info blocks. So once we've filled this out, simply click Save. It's going to run that workflow action. We see it starting to instantiate Customer C here. If I click on here, you'll see history where we have the workflow currently running. If I click on that, it's going to show us that this is the provisioning. If I view the job, this is the actual workflow job that got kicked off. And you'll see here the workflow steps were create. In this case, this particular piece is creating the VPC deployment, the data center, and the security rules in Panorama. So this is the live job. It's actually already completed. So if we go back here to the job information, if I go back to instance C, you'll see it's completed. And because it's completed, and now the whole provisioning process, so we've provisioned cloud, we've provisioned data center, we've provisioned security rules in our Palo Alto firewalls through Panorama. We've populated the information that we've defined we wanted to track. So that workflow is not only instantiating all of those things through those three different domains, but it's also tracking and saving the information that we defined in our resource model. So you'll see things here like here's the VPC IDs that have been assigned to this customer. Here's the data center port parameters that we have assigned to the customer, as well as the security parameters as well. And so finally, if you start to look at these different customers over time, not only can you get everything at a glance, but as the different services go through different stages of its life cycle, you'll have a full history. From the history, you can also click onto any one of those steps to see the actual job through a workflow that was run and all the data in and out that was used for it and associated with it. So with Lifecycle Manager, this is stateful orchestration, the ability to define all of the data that you want to track for any type of infrastructure service, and then over time to instantiate it using existing workflows and track that information as needed so that it makes managing the lifecycle from beginning to end of any kind of complex network service simple and efficient.